Welcome everyone to the 2018 Preschool Mindfulness Summit. I'm very excited to welcome our next guest to the summit, who's somebody we're really lucky to have share his expertise with us. Dr. Ronald D. Siegel is our next guest. He's the assistant professor at Harvard University Medical School and the author of many academic texts and articles about mindfulness that are used all over the world by researchers, including me. And so we really appreciate that. And he's also a teacher who travels and teaches mindfulness in all corners of the world as well as mind-body work. And he's the author of a very practical book, which I love, called The Mindful Solution: Everyday Practices for Everyday Problems. And I highly recommend you get that book because it's a very nice book that flows through lots of activities that you can do in it to really put things into practice for yourself. So his topic today is mindful parenting of preschool children. So welcome, Dr. Siegel.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So let's just start by learning a little bit about your own journey into mindfulness and how you got interested in this topic and then became well known in the field. And I think you've been working 30 years in Harvard University now, haven't you?
I have. It was rather accidental. It was, I was a high school student and I was growing up in the New York metropolitan area, and it was the early 1970s. It was a time of a fair amount of countercultural influence, a lot of interest in meditation practices, and I was interested in psychology. And if you were interested in psychology in those days, there were always people around who were talking about meditation practices. So I got into it really as a kid, and interestingly, when I first started doing this, I was extremely impressed by the power of these practices. I started tasting my food, being present to experience, being less preoccupied with what my high school girlfriend was up to at the time, a little bit less anxious about, going to college and all that kind of thing. And I imagine this trajectory that if I kept up with these practices, by the time that I was old, which at that point in my life I figured was my mid-20s, by the time I was old, I would be hanging around in states of bliss, enjoying the present moment, and everybody would love me. It hasn't exactly unfolded that way. Rather, life has plenty of ups and downs. And I've had an experience. I've had the benefit of many skilled mindfulness teachers, and really the main goal of a skilled mindfulness teacher is not just to teach the techniques. That's relatively straightforward, but how to help a person understand how the mind creates suffering for itself. And it's zeroing in on how we get in our own way and create suffering for ourselves. That's really the talent of a skilled teacher. And of the many that I've had over the years, probably none have been quite as skilled as my twin daughters. And they were very good at illustrating how the mind created suffering when they were adolescents. And I'll give you an example. We'd be running late for, an appointment at the dentist's office or something. And I would start to get agitated and, speak in what they came to affectionately call that voice, right? And one of them would invariably pipe up and say, hey, Dad, haven't you written whole books about being in the present moment? Haven't you traveled around the world teaching mental health professionals, in essence, how to let go of things you can't control and focus on what you can? And I'm very proud to say that I never once reacted in a way that got me reported to the Department of Protective Services. Wow. And now they're much older. They're both adults and they're in the sciences, and we can have very nuanced conversations of this, because not that their recollection of my parenting is incorrect, but what we can identify now is that we never had a control group. We have no idea what kind of parenting they might have been subjected to had it not been for all those years of mindfulness practice. And I'm quite convinced it would have been a lot worse. So our theme here could be how to avoid it how to make sure it doesn't become a lot worse and use mindfulness practices to facilitate that.
That's funny because I have two daughters, and they say exactly the same thing to me every time I get a bit frazzled. Mom, aren't you supposed to know how to do this? But yes, they don't know how much worse it could be. Right?
Exactly.
Great. So tell us why you chose to focus on parenting for this talk today.
It's very interesting. I spent 25 years in what's called child community mental health, basically as the chief psychologist for most of those years at a clinic that treated all sorts of families with an emphasis on perhaps inner city families, but we saw quite a range. And it was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which has tremendous cultural diversity. In fact, the high school at one point, I think, had kids there whose parents spoke 47 different languages at home. Because we attract graduate students and their immigrant populations in Cambridge. So we spent a lot of time paying attention to culture and cultural diversity. And it occurred to me pretty early on that kids live in a very different culture than their parents do. And that there are a number of aspects to this, even if they're not an immigrant population, but they're in a homogeneous culture. Kids have a different sense of reality, right? Fantasy, particularly little kids, fantasy and reality fluidly flow from one another. They have a different sense of time, and they're less attached to words. And the part about time, I think, is particularly interesting. I know a lot of folks listening will have young children at home. And I remember when my kids reached the age of 2 and they entered what's often called the terrible twos, I was actually teaching a course at a Harvard teaching hospital with a woman named Carlin Lyons-Ruth, who's a very well-known developmental psychologist and researcher. And I said, so Carlin, you know developmental psychology better than anybody. What's up with the terrible twos here? And she basically explained that it's the product of cognitive maturation. If you have a child who's 1 year of age and they start to fuss, you can say, hey, look at Teddy. Teddy's dancing. Oh, now Teddy's dancing on his head. He's quite the acrobat, right? And you do that for a little bit, and the child forgets about what their concern was, and things are fine. By the time a child reaches the age of 2 or perhaps 3, what happens is the child fusses, they want something, and you go, hey, look at Teddy. Teddy's dancing. Teddy's quite the acrobat, and it looks like it's working. And oh, now he's dancing on his head. And now he's dancing on his arms. Now he's dancing on his feet. This is wonderful. And the child is quite engaged, but then the child turns to you and says, okay, now give it to me. Because they have the cognitive capacity to remember and to get attached to things and to hold on to them. So, and this proceeds over the course of development from infancy, where kids really are in the present moment, to toddlerhood, where they begin to have more of an attachment to the past and the future, to later ages where they're thinking a lot about the past and the future, until we get into adulthood, when we're never in the present moment. We're just always lost in fantasies of the future, anxieties, our to-do list or the like, or regrets about the stuff that we've done wrong. So if we're going to enter the culture of a child, we have to actually be able to bring our attention back into the present, because they're living more in the present than we are, to be less attached to words, because, kids are much more interested in play and action than they are words, and to have a much more fluid sense of reality. And mindfulness practices can help us to do this. Now, why is it essential to work with ourselves as parents or teachers? And this is also something that I learned in the clinic. We would have clinicians who were really quite talented, and let's say, just to make up an arbitrary number, that in one 50-minute psychotherapeutic hour, they could resolve we'll call it 1 unit of trauma or 1 unit of psychological distress. But if that child was accumulating in the interactions at home or in what was going on in school or in the neighborhood, 1.5 units of psychological distress or trauma in the intervening week, the slope of treatment was not going to go well. But if we could do something to help parents, to help teachers, to help other members of the community, to provide a healthier, salutary environment for the child, well, it becomes like raising a plant. You give it enough, water and fertilizer and access to sunlight, and you don't disturb the roots, and chances are the plant will grow. And actually that's true for kids. Our main task as parents is to try to create that kind of salutary environment, and as teachers as well. So the emphasis of the clinic became very much, okay, how do we understand kids on their own terms? And how do we provide this kind of salutary environment? So that's why the emphasis on parenting, and that's why the emphasis on mindfulness practice for parents, for teachers, for the grown-ups who are in the lives of children. Not to say that teaching these practices to kids aren't useful. They are. There's a huge mindful schools program. I'm sure others will talk about that. But I think where I see the greatest bang for the buck, if you will, or the greatest return for our efforts, is in our own practice as adults dealing with kids.
Yeah, I agree, definitely. And because kids model us as well, don't they? And they're watching how we react to everything. So how do you feel that mindfulness can help parents to to be better parents in general?
Well, it can help in a number of ways. Mostly it can help us with our own reactivity. Because, I'll make the joke about, the Department of Protective Services, and I did manage to keep my behavior shy of that line. Our adult presence is so important for regulating kids' emotions and for helping kids to learn how to regulate their own emotions. When we talk about, in the mental health field, there's a lot of talk about trying to develop secure attachment. And what that means isn't that the kid is glued to the parent in some way. What that means is that when a child is distressed, a parent is able to successfully comfort that child and help that child to re-regulate emotionally, to come back into some kind of equilibrium where they feel safe, where they feel in a kind of homeostasis, they feel like they're okay. And the principal tool that we have in helping our kids to regulate is our own capacity to regulate our own emotions. I'll give you an example. Actually, it comes from a Zen teacher, but in relatively modern times. And the Zen teacher is Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a wonderfully gifted Zen teacher. He's done a lot to bring Zen practices into the West. And he's Vietnamese. And he worked a lot in Vietnam during the war. And he was describing what happened during the fall of Saigon. And for anybody who's, hasn't seen or read that history, basically the fall of Saigon was a very chaotic time at the end of the Vietnam War, mostly because the American ambassador couldn't bear the thought that the South Vietnamese army and the Americans were losing the war. And because he couldn't bear the thought, he couldn't make good contingency plans. And it was just sheer chaos. The airport had been overrun by the North Vietnamese army, and people were fleeing on refugee boats, rafts, anything they could do to get away. And these refugee boats were terribly overcrowded. The people on them had often had traumatic experiences. They were separated from their families. And on top of everything else, they were frequently beset by pirates. And nobody knew whether the other country, they're heading for Australia and New Zealand, a place like that, nobody knew if they were going to be let in or not. So you could imagine this was a very distressed group. And what Thich Nhat Hanh observed, and others on these boats observed was, if there would be one person who had a kind of equanimity, a capacity to bear their feelings and not be too powerfully frightened and reactive to that, you could kind of see concentric circles around that person of people who themselves had a little bit more calm, a little bit more perspective, a little bit more courage. On the other hand, if you saw somebody who was flailing around in anger or in fear, you would see concentric circles around that person of anger and fear. Our capacity to bear our feelings and to have some kind of perspective, equanimity, we might call it wisdom and compassion, is very contagious. And it's particularly contagious between children and parents, and particularly young children. There's a researcher at one of the Harvard teaching hospitals, a children's hospital in Boston, named Ed Tronick, who has spent a lifetime basically focusing one video camera on the mother or the father, was usually mothers, and one video camera on a young child, often an infant, but a little older also, and filming what happens and then slowing down the video to watch the interactions. And as it turns out, there are up to 10 times a second, these microscopic interactions that happen between parent and child. The child gestures, the parent responds, then the child responds to the parent's response, and like that. Much too fast to follow consciously. So it's really only if we have an inner sense of equilibrium, an inner sense that this is going to be okay, I can weather this, I can bear this feeling, including the feeling when a child is angry, when a child is hurting, when a child is distant from us, when a child wants us more than we want to be with the child. All of these moments that can create a sense of disharmony, if we can tolerate those, have the wisdom to understand it's all part of the parenting experience, and still be present and attentive to the child, that goes a very long way toward helping the child to regulate their inner world. And if a child can learn to regulate their inner world in real time growing up, they bring that capacity with them as adults. What we know in studying adults is the single greatest predictor of whether an adult is going to have a psychologically, basically happy life, a life of well-being psychologically, is whether they have internalized this capacity to regulate their emotions, to bear it when there's sadness, when there's anger, when there's fear, even at high levels, and are able to be with that, trust that it will come and go, and that comes from internalizing this parent who is able to do it. And the beauty of mindfulness practices, they actually teach us how to do this. I shouldn't say teach because it sounds like a cognitive thing. They train us how to do this. They allow us to practice being with thoughts and feelings. And how does this happen? Well, we're sitting in some kind of meditation practice, right? And a thought arises. And rather than immediately act on that thought, we observe it. We allow the thought to come and go. We notice the body's response to that thought, but we don't immediately move into action. Or an ache or an itch arises when we're doing a little bit of meditation practice. And rather than doing what we automatically would do, which is to scratch the itch or adjust our posture to resolve the ache, what we do is we learn to, okay, let me just experience the itch or the ache and turn my attention to that with a kind of open, aware, loving presence, and see what happens. And we tend to notice, oh, the itch and the ache comes and goes. And the same thing happens to a wave of sadness, a wave of anger, a wave of fear. Same thing happens to a wave of joy, to a wave of love, to a wave of connectedness. We start to get it, that all emotional experience is this fluid, unfolding kaleidoscope. And as we do that, we develop a kind of equanimity, not a flat equanimity in which we're not feeling things, but rather we learn to surf. They often say in mindfulness practice, we're not trying to stop the waves, we're learning how to surf, to actually experience all of this changing phenomena. And those of you who care for preschoolers know, wow, there's a lot of waves. It's sometimes choppy, sometimes smooth. There's so much going on all the time. And mindfulness practices actually teach us how to ride those waves. So that, in a nutshell, is why the practices are particularly of use to us as parents or teachers.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and that's why I'm so passionate about bringing this to preschool children and through parents and through programs, because I just think if children learn these type of skills when they're preschoolers, they're going to have such an amazing skill to take them through life and not have to suffer as much, but learn to ride the wave early
Right.
on, and get through all the ups and downs that everybody has in life. So yeah, that was very interesting. So what particular parenting challenges do you think mindfulness can help with?
Well, one of the biggies, I think, is how to handle our own emotions. So if I were to say to you, for example, or say to any of our viewers today, yesterday I got really, really angry, and you had been with me, what might you have observed? What do you think?
Red face, shaking body movements, shortness of breath.
Right, loud voice perhaps, right? And almost all of us know what that looks like, right? But it was actually, my question was actually a little bit of a trick question, because I could have meant one of two things. I could have meant, And we don't even have an easy way to distinguish these two in English, so my language will sound awkward. I could have meant yesterday I felt anger arising in the mind and heart. I could have meant yesterday I acted angrily. But we are so accustomed to action following on feeling and action following on thought that we don't even think of these as distinct events. And one of the things that we learn to do in mindfulness practice is to take a breath. We learn to notice that all behavior is the result of a sequence. And the sequence is always the same. There's a stimulus of some sort. We see something, we hear something, we feel something in the body. Then there's our own reaction to that stimulus. I like it, I don't like it, it scares me, it puts my defenses up, it makes me relax and feel open. We have a response to everything that happens. And then there's an impulse to do something, right? I'm going to fight back. I'm going to grab the kid. I'm going to hug the child. Whatever it is, there's some kind of impulse. And then there's the actual behavior of acting on that impulse. So it's a chain of events that goes between a stimulus occurring and our actual behavior in the world. And most of the time, this is so rapid and so automatic that we simply see the behaviors coming from the stimulus. What happens with mindfulness practice, again, to come back to the example of a thought arising or a feeling arising or an itch arising or an ache arising, is instead of immediately acting on it, we simply experience it for a bit and perhaps turn our attention toward it with a kind of curiosity and a sense of investigation, like, oh, what is this impulse? Or what is it that's scaring me here? Or what is, how am I feeling? Why, look at this response as though I'm an organism under threat. What's up here? And taking that moment to observe what's happening and not just acting on it helps us to make a wiser choice when it comes to acting. Most of the stuff that goes wrong in parenting does not go wrong because we carefully thought it out, we talked about it with our partner or our family and our friends, and we decided to implement some mode of action. Most of the stuff that goes wrong in parenting happens because we lose it in one way or another. Stimulus comes, we have an emotional response, and we act on that response. And very often, it's the mistakes run in the direction of anger. Mistakes can run the other way for somebody who is so uncomfortable with their anger or perhaps was so exposed to inappropriate anger that they hold back too much and they can't even mobilize the necessary aggression to say no firmly to a child when a child needs to hear no. But very often the mistakes come from going with the feeling and the feelings happening when we're threatened. A good friend and colleague of mine named Trudy Goodman, who actually runs a place called Insight LA. Any of you who are in LA and want to learn mindfulness practice, she has a wonderful operation going there. And she used to do clinical work. And she first invented, I think, the term parenting crimes. And parenting crimes are all those things that we've done that afterwards we can't believe we did it because they run so counter to all the parent guidance advice. What does parent guidance advice say? Okay, you want to set clear, consistent, and firm limits and also develop an atmosphere of love and acceptance in each moment of interaction with your child. How many honest people do you know that are good at doing that? This is... Yeah, this is not easy. This is not easy to do. We fall down often and we commit these parenting crimes. And then we've got all the self-retribution going. We hate ourselves. We feel badly about it. And often that makes matters worse. It makes us even more agitated, more angry, more anxious, and the like. So if we could have a way to, on the one hand, not make so many parenting crimes because we're going a little more slowly and having a little bit more opportunity to take that breath and decide rather than react. And then even if we do blow it and we make the parenting crimes, and it's kind of funny as a psychologist, parenting crimes feel worse, right? Like we're really supposed to know better. We write the parent guidance books. If you're a child psychologist, it feels unconscionable. How could you possibly have done that? And yet we all do these things. So we also need some form of absolution, right? Some way that we can forgive ourselves when these things happen and recognize our common humanity in this. This is sometimes nowadays called self-compassion, a sense of, it's okay, sweetheart, not just for our kid, but for ourselves, that, okay, you lost it again. That's perfectly understandable. We all lose it. Chalk it up to your rap sheet of parenting crimes. You can repair this, and then move in to repair it, rather than get caught in the self-hatred around it. So the practices are particularly, I think, helpful for that. They're also helpful, I think, for connecting to kids. I'm sure you've got daughters. You said, you've done bedtime rituals that perhaps involve reading a bedtime story, right? That's often the case for people who are oriented toward books in the world, right? And I've been through moments like this one, like, you're in the bookstore or at the library or looking online, and you come across a book which is age appropriate for a child and seems really interesting, well reviewed, and you think, I'll get that. You bring it home, and, you wash up for bed, and you're sitting there, and you excitedly tell your young child that, I have this new book. It's really supposed to be interesting. I thought we could read it together tonight. And the child says, oh, well, that's nice, but could we read Goodnight Moon instead? And you say, well, honey, Goodnight Moon is inspirational and wonderful literature. I agree. And, but we've read it quite a few times before, and we kind of know how that turns out. You may find this interesting. It's a little bit different. Yeah, but, oh, please, Goodnight Moon, Goodnight Moon. And then you settled into the 238th reading of Goodnight Moon, right? And the child is delighted. People who do well with preschool kids are people who are comfortable with repetition, right? They're okay with it. They recognize that the child likes the repetition. It feels comforting. It feels familiar. They feel they're learning something each time because, they're looking at it with fresh eyes. They're a little bit more in the present and a little bit more like, here it is. They're able to savor it a little bit more than the adult is. And one of the things that happens with mindfulness practice is we stop craving entertainment so much, because once I gave a talk at Google once, and in fact, I'll offer a link to that to our listeners. It was really interesting. Google is very big on mindfulness practices. They've got meditation halls in all of the buildings, and they call it a tool for developing higher resolution consciousness. More pixels per square centimeter, if you will. The ability to really notice in a nuanced way what's going on all day long. And when we develop this, we don't need TV as much. We don't need the internet as much, because even small things like looking at a flower, like tasting lunch, like watching the sun or the leaves start to become rich and fulfilling, including just playing with our child without feeling compelled to have some other level of entertainment, whether it be the new book or, more problematically these days, can parents pull their attention away from their smartphone long enough to stay with the child? Because the smartphone is, in some ways, feels more interesting, right? It's a higher stimulus object, so it attracts our attention more regularly. As we do these practices, we develop this much more subtle and nuanced capacity to be with subtle and nuanced experiences, including just playing the same game. Or, okay, it's Candyland again. That's all right. Chutes and ladders. Wonder what'll happen this time. And that allows us to be present with young children in a way which is quite powerful and quite nurturing to them, but doesn't come all that naturally to some of us.
Right. Yeah. I think a lot of parents always want to bring something new, something. They're trying to give their children lots of opportunities and things, but as you say, just doing those repetitive activities might actually bring us more into the present moment than always looking for something different, something else to do. So,
and it may provide more joy and connection for the child.
Yeah, you're right. Toddlers love repetition. That's probably their favorite thing is again, isn't it? So
right, yeah.
yeah. Well, thank you very much. Those were really interesting points, and I'm sure our audience is going to take a lot of information away and a lot of practical things that they can start to do at home with their children, or teachers can do in preschools.
You know, I wanted to say one more thing before we, you know, I'm sure a lot of parents, if you're a parent of a young child, you're so busy all the time, and the idea of like taking some extra time to just be with my own experience may feel like it's too self-focused, or my to-do list is going to grow. I just want to offer this suggestion that perhaps it will make the time that you are with your child more efficient in several ways. It'll make it more connected, so the child will actually get more of the nurturing that they need in a shorter period of time, as well as you won't be getting in your own way as much. So you'll be able to do things, even the practical things, more efficiently, that it's worth the gamble of taking some time out to develop this higher resolution consciousness, this equanimity, this capacity to be present, and see whether, even if perhaps there's 20 minutes or half an hour less of the day for activity, that activity is enriched in a way that makes it worth it for you.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. And I think a lot of the questions I get from parents are they don't know where to start. So what would you say to a parent who doesn't know where to start? They think they have to read a lot of books and.
Well, I have some resource. I mean, there's many wonderful resources. I'll just mention the ones that I had a hand in authoring. So the book that you mentioned, The Mindfulness Solution: Everyday Practices for Everyday Problems, it's really how to develop one of these practices, and then how to use it to work with anxiety, to work with sadness or depression, to work even with physical pain, to work with the challenges of parenting, to work with other interpersonal challenges, and those kinds of themes. So that's one resource. There's a website, which I believe you'll provide a link to, which is mindfulness-solution.com. It goes with the book. And there you can download a lot of different meditations and try them out and see the effects of the different meditations. The instructions are in the book, but you can get the audio files from the website. And also, for those who are interested, offer a free gift, which is actually a way to get to that talk that I did with Google, which also in a condensed way goes through how to use these practices to work with everyday problems. So if reading a book feels daunting, you can get a taste of it there.
The video is really informative, and it goes through lots of things step by step, and including how to start meditating. So I think it's a really good resource for parents as well. So thank you again for joining us and sharing all your knowledge with us. I really appreciated it, and I'm sure our audience really appreciates it. And I hope to keep in touch with you and hear more about what you're doing. If you have any new books coming out or new programs, and just want to say thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.